Here is a blue ink by Sailor Bungubox Fujiyama Blue.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
It's called a blue, but I see more of a turquoise. But tomato, tomato, or tomato, or, whatever. But for the sake of this, I'm going to refer to it as a blue because that's what was on the vial when I got it. It isn't too light to read, and if a lighter blue is your preference, I can see this one being very enjoyable. A bunch. There is some tone variation by pen, but it's never too light to read comfortably for a whole page, which is a great thing when it comes to lighter inks. It does shade, but gently when it does it, and not in a standout, really obvious kind of way, really gently. I think for an ink this light, that it shades so gently and not tons, really does work in its benefit, because if it shaded too much, then it would make me long for the darker tones, perhaps. So I think what we're getting is a very nice blue to be enjoyed by a lot of people. I really enjoyed using it, and I normally don't go for blues this light.
The pen for today is
Cross Wanderlust.
all of the writing samples are done with
A Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib. A Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib. A Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, you can see that this is easily read on the page. Just as I said, we get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some shading. Now, ignoring the very dark H that happens in the on the first line, but the majority of the writing, if you see and on the second line, you see the D gets a little bit lighter. Groped is a nice even mid-tone where about lightens up just a little bit and gets a little bit darker at the T. Again, none of this is too light to read, and I really do find it enjoyable on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we get with the fine nib. Now, it starts out writing darker, but it was inked up a couple of days before, and it does level off in its writing. And when it levels off, I think it looks at its very best, not in the darker tone that we're seeing in the very beginning. We get no feathering, and we get no spread. We still get some very gentle shading going on. You see it gets a little bit darker spots in the word anything on the second line, but nothing right next to it. Starts lighter, goes into some darker and lighter tones, really at the thing part of nothing. Looking at the stub nib, it is right about the same tone that we got with the medium, as in right about mostly the lighter tone. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we get only a few hints of shading. Largely what we're getting is a very gentle light blue on the page. Again, I can read this without any kind of a problem. I do wish that it would shade a little bit more, just a little bit more on the stub, and I would be very happy to be able to see it, but it's not coming through. I really like what it did on the medium. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get right about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a nice, gentle blue the whole way through. That is easy to read. That does still bring little bits of shading. You see it in guess on the first line, no problem. Well on the second line, no problem. Crawled on the third line, no problem. This ink is no problem on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get little bits of shading. For some reason, that first word, again, started just a little bit darker. But it evened out just as it did before, making me really kind of expect a darker word as the first word from a medium. The shading is very nice and gentle. It's not shading as much as it did on the Clairfontaine, but I still think it's doing a very nice job of it. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium, or as a majority of the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shade, but we do get a very easy to read ink on the page, even with its lighter tone. I'm kind of maybe leaning towards some lighter tones because of this ink. It's really very appealing to see. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is no longer a blue, but really a green. Result of the paper, not unexpected, not really a surprise, not what you would want if this ink is what you were expecting. Now, as it performs, there's no feather, there's no spread, there's light bits of shading. It's not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Definitely missing out on the light blue here. Really, if it were a turquoise, it would be going from a blue leaning to a green leaning, but it's a blue. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, about as dark as we were getting on the Clairfontaine, though still being a green and not a blue here, with no feather, with no spread, with little bits of shading. I don't think the shading is showing up as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it's definitely there. You see it on complete in the second line. You see miserableness on the second line has it. While on the third line has it. Definitely there. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just as dark as on the Clairfontaine, though still a green, not a blue, still the paper with no feathering, with no spread, yet with a little bit more shading coming through, since the Clairfontaine really had none, and it is showing it here some. You see it in kitchen, you see it in at, both on the first line. Look at right in the center on the second line, for he could. All three words, a very nice shading, really stepping up its game for shading here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The shading is the same as the Clairefontaine. It's really doing very nice, very easy to read. The most distracting thing about this is that quad rule paper. This is not a good ink for if you like quad rule, because it kind of gets lost in all of those vertical lines. Looking at the medium nib, it is just about the same tone as the extra fine, which is a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread. It does shade better than it did with the extra fine, not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, though when it's doing it, I think it's doing a fairly decent job. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairefontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading, which was not there on the Clairefontaine, but is there here. Again, we're dealing with more of an issue of the vertical lines, making it kind of distracting to see. They're just close enough in their darkness that it's a problem for me, but the writing on the page is very nice, especially if this was an unruled page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Omi Osan. Here is Delta Blue. Here is Monteverde Horizon Blue. Here is Sailor Yuki Akari. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. Still can kind of read it, still really having a problem with the vertical lines for it. It's just a matter of there's too much going on with the tone of this ink. Again, it really does kind of need a blank page to not draw any attention away from this writing, and I see it as being without any kind of issue. No feather, no spread, does not shade nearly as much as it did on the Clairefontaine, though we do get few spots for it. Right in the middle of the page, the R in for or he directly underneath it, felt to the right of that, has some nice lighter and darker tones, really showing what it could do. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tiny bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get good shading for this paper, not good shading in comparison to the Clairefontaine, but this paper doesn't normally get inks to shade especially well, so the loss of it's a problem. The darkness or lightness of this ink, if you were to use it in a lab setting to, like as a student, I think this would really work against you because you'd kind of lose what you wrote. And don't do any kind of math where you have to do graphs on it, because my God, you're going to lose it all. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone that it was with the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with much better shading than it had on the Clairefontaine. It had almost none, but here it is shading fairly well. Look at Shattered. Starts darker, works a little lighter at the A, darkens up at the TH, lightens up at the end of the word. His, darker at the H, lighter at the I, dark at the S. Hope's, same thing, darker to lighter. Shading looks really good here, especially a paper that doesn't normally bring out the shading. Looking at the back of the page, there should be no surprise, but there is no bleeding, and surprise, there is no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Cairo Iro Cherry Blossom of Kieg.
Here is an orange ink by Sailor, Studio 873.
Here is a magenta ink by Krishna Naval.
Here is a shimmering yellow ink by Pelikan, Edelstein Golden Barrel.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, as copy paper frequently does. We do get some feathering and we do get some spread. The spread's not horrible. It's not quite all the way up to a medium. And we even do get some shading going on, some much darker letters, which make me worry about whether or not I get any kind of bleed. I think what I'm seeing here is fairly usable without any real problem. I think if you like 20-pound copy paper and you want to use it, you could, though it's not showing as much as a blue here. We're really starting to see a little bit more as a green. Interesting. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone as the extra fine. A little bit lighter in darkness than it was on a Clairfontaine, still seeing a little bit more of that green than blue in this. We do get feathering and we do get spread. It does not spread all the way up to being broad, just a little bit thicker than a medium normally is. And I really notice it because I'm seeing them side by side. The feathering's not out of control, definitely making it manageable. Shading, there is a little bit. It does poke its head out from moment to moment. Look at the U in crushed or the H in crushed. You see it's there. It's just not like stand out as, it's not as nice as it was on other papers, but it's copy paper. So what are you going to do? Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, still being a little green leaning as compared to the Clairfontaine. We do still get feathering. We still get spread. Both of those should not be any kind of a surprise. What we're seeing here, I don't think the stub works as well on the copy paper because it's really the spread and the feather together are going to make a lot of your letters kind of disappear and close up unless you have garbage handwriting like I do, but I can read it, so that's okay. There is moments of shading. I mean, you see it on little in the third line. You see it in little on the fourth line. There's only a little shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see how deep the ink gets into the page. There's plenty of ghosting going on because it's copy paper, but none of this bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Normally, with an ink that's lighter like this, I might want to darken it up some by using a wetter pen, but this tone is very nice and calming, so I don't want a gusher to try and make it darker. But I really want a medium flow, maybe slightly dry, but a medium flow of really any nib except the stub. But that's because the shading didn't really come through in the stub as nice as it could have. In any kind of round nib, I think you're getting something really good. I just think the stub was but the medium was really spot on. Medium flow, a medium, great way to go here.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.